Hi everyone, welcome to Mindgasms. So, I'm going to do a history of sexuality vlog today on the book The History of Sexuality Part 1 by Michel Foucault, which I've done that series before, of course. And let me see here. Show you a picture of the book there. That's History of Sexuality Part 1. And so Foucault did what is called historiography in many of his books that are often put into the category of philosophy. Historiography is basically the history of ideas, concepts, and perspectives. And I will show you a picture of Foucault right here too. He's weird-looking, bald French dude, of course. And so let me see here. That's a picture of Foucault. There you go. There's a picture of him expressing a complex point. And Foucault was very controversial, of course. So like I said, he did historiography, which is basically the history of ideas, concepts, and perspectives. In Discipline and Punish, which is one of his books that I made a video about a while ago, I'll add a link for that somewhere in the video and in the description for this. Foucault writes about the history of cultural attitudes and behavior towards criminals. In Madness and Civilization, which I will make a video, write a blog about later at some point, Foucault talks about the history of cultural attitudes and behavior toward people with mental disorders. In all the handful or so of his books that I've read, Foucault seems to analyze how these cultural attitudes have changed from approximately the 1600s to the 1800s and through to today. He also uses a multi-factoral analysis. He explains the contributing causes that led to behaviors and attitudes changing from many different angles. There are a lot of reasons that attitudes towards certain groups of people and behaviors change throughout history. So Foucault was associated with a movement of thinkers called Post-Modernists, and you've probably heard about this before because public intellectuals talk about it a lot. And so Post-Modernism here, I'll just show you a cool picture here of kind of an image that someone made of postmodernism. So let me see here. Okay, that's postmodernism there, of course. And so, of course, Foucault was associated with postmodernism, but he himself did not really accept the label of postmodernism. And I'll show you a definition of postmodernism here. So let me see. And because he didn't accept the label of postmodernist, and Foucault and Derrida were often labeled as postmodernists by other people, but they didn't accept that label. They were actually kind of more like post-structuralists, and there's a distinction to be made between postmodernism and post-structuralism, and these are just the Wikipedia definitions, so they're not exactly right, but I'll explain the difference here. So postmodernism is a broad movement that developed in the mid to late 20th century across philosophy, the arts, architecture, and criticism, marking a departure from modernism. The term has been more generally applied to describe a historical era said to follow after modernity and the tendencies of this era. So I've talked about this many times in my videos before. There's the distinction between the postmodern era, the postmodern condition, and postmodernism. So according to people who others call postmodernists, we're living in the postmodern era right now, which is just after modernism and after a lot of the institutions and cultural aspects of modernism, like churches and religion. And, Nietzsche talked about the death of God, for example, meaning the decline of religion in society, for example. And it's also, there's postmodern art, that weird art, and there's postmodern philosophy that Foucault is often put into the category of, although, like I said, he's not necessarily actually a postmodernist. And there are postmodern books and postmodern movies, and there are lots of different distinctions like that, or different examples like that, I should say. So, like I said, postmodernism is different from post-structuralism, and Foucault and Derrida and many other thinkers like those French intellectuals in the 70s who were very controversial. They were more like post-structuralists, although they wouldn't necessarily have referred to themselves as post-structuralists either. So there's a picture here of post-structuralism and a definition about how it can be distinguished from postmodernism as well. And so let me see here. That's just a cool picture of post-structuralism and all the stuff that goes into it. Like you have a historical perspective, philosophers talk about it, they talk about meaning, identity, heterosexuality, anthropology, concepts, all that other sort of cool stuff. And let me see here. Okay, I'm gonna close that one here and open this other one and explain to you the distinction between postmodernism and post-structuralism. So, let me see here. So, like I said, postmodernism is different from post-structuralism, and Foucault was not a postmodernist, as a lot of public intellectuals claim that he was. So, post-structuralism here is a term for the philosophical, theoretical, and literary forms of theory that both build upon and reject ideas established by structuralism, the intellectual project that preceded it. So the difference between post-structuralism and structuralism is kind of similar to the difference between postmodernism and modernism, except that post-structuralism is more of a philosophical movement, which is why thinkers like Foucault and Derrida were more like post-structuralists than postmodernists. So I'm going to show you a cool picture that someone made here of post-structuralism. And of course, there are many aspects that you can talk about post-structuralism in similar ways that you can talk about postmodernism. There are different ways of looking at it, like it's analytical theory, and it examines culture and history and ideas, and Foucault's more about history and Derrida's more about language, basically. And then there are always like people who look at history from a postmodernist or post-structuralist analysis, who are sociologists as well, and there are people who are of different political persuasions as well, like they're Marxists and they're anti-Marxists, basically. So like I said, post-structuralism followed structuralism, and this is basically an era of history, it's not an era of history. It's a way of thinking that occurred during modernism. It's important to make that distinction here. And it's kind of like looking at, so I'll define it here. Structuralism is the intellectual movement and philosophical orientation often associated initially with the Western discourses of Levi Strauss, Marx, and Althusser, for example, who claimed to analyze and explain invariant structures and in the constitutive of nature, society, and the human psyche. So it's kind of like, it's not the same as this, but you know how Marx he talks about historical materialism, for example, and it's kind of similar to that, but it's not exactly the same thing. It's kind of the way that public intellectuals think about society and the structures and the institutions throughout the modern era, like religion and churches and governments, like I said, right? So someone made a cool picture of this there too. And so I'll show you that. And of course, like I mentioned before, public intellect, and I try to mention in all of these videos, public intellectuals get so-called postmodernism and post-structuralism wrong all the time. Like Jordan Peterson, of course, as I've described many times, gets everything he says about postmodernism totally wrong. And here's a cool picture of structuralism here with all the things that go into it: analysis, positivism, linguists, so language, science. It examines how all of these ideas occur and how we look at them differently throughout history, basically. So here's a picture of angry Jordan Peterson. And let me do this here. We'll share this. So this is an important distinction to make between post-structuralism and postmodernism, right? Because obviously, like I said, there's different things. And here is a picture of angry Jordan Peterson being angry about postmodernism. And, you know, he talks about postmodern neo-Marxists, even though Marxists hated postmodernists and postmodernists hated Marxists, and they still do. And Marxism is an absolutist narrative, and postmodernism is all about a lack of absolutism. And, you know, Jordan Peterson says all these things, says that Foucault and Derrida and other thinkers said all sorts of things that they didn't actually say. So anyway, now that I've gone through structuralism and post-structuralism a little bit, I will get back to talking about this section of the book, The History of Sexuality. So I'll have a nice eye-catching picture up here for while I'm talking about this. So let me see here. There we go. That's sex. So that's what we're talking about. All right. So this is called Part 8, Sex is a Weapon of Power. So I'm going to go right to starting off this quote here. And so let me see. So this is what Foucault says about how sex operates and is seen in modern Western societies, along with how it and power play off of and use each other. He also explains how this impacts relationships between different groups of people. Quote, sexuality must not be described as a stubborn drive by nature alien and of necessity disobedient to a power which exhausts itself trying to subdue it and often fails to control it entirely. It appears rather as an especially dense transfer point for relations of power between men and women, young people and old people, parents and offspring, teachers and students, priests and laity, and administration and a population. Sexuality is not the most intractable element in power relations, but rather one of those endowed with the greatest instrumentality, useful for the greatest number of maneuvers and capable of serving as a point of support, as a linchpin for the most varied strategies. Okay, so let me explain that here. And okay, let me go to my explanation. And we're going to get to what this has to do with sexuality. Okay. So there's a lot going on in that paragraph, so it'll take a lot to explain it. But this is a good picture here describing some aspects that go into sexuality, like bodies, thoughts and feelings, values and beliefs, gender and relationships. And we're mostly talking about relationships in this paragraph here. So Foucault seems to be saying here that sex is not simply an evolutionary drive over which we have no control. It's not like you think with your dick if you're a guy, or your vagina if you're a woman, and you can't stop yourself. We aren't just slaves to our sexual urges. This means that others can also have power over sex and or use it as a way to manipulate people and gain more power. Sex is a way to transfer power between different types of people in relationships. Sexuality, or the way that people act around each other in terms of sexual topics and actions, not necessarily sex itself, is a way that people exchange power. It's how men and women, young people and old people, parents and children, teachers and students, priests and their congregations, along with governments and populations, influence one another. This often just includes how people talk about sex. We all know that sexual urges have an effect on how men and women interact with each other. Sexuality can and often is used to manipulate your relationship with someone who you're attracted to, or with someone who is attracted to you, even in subtle ways. Stereotypes are often true that old people puritanically preach to young people about the apparent dangers of promiscuous sex. The opposite power dynamic happens in the opposite direction too, as it always does. Young people can sometimes convince old people to be more open-minded about at least discussing sexuality. Maybe you'll have grandma and grandpa experimenting with dildos in no time. So obviously, it's not just like everything is all about power and power is always bad. People are using it in different ways for specific purposes, and it's both conscious and unconscious. So let's talk about here. So the relationship between children and parents. So that can be similar to the relationship between young people and old people. So, give me a second here. So children and parents. So I have a good image here, and let's talk about that here. So, like I said, it can be similar. It can be similar to the way that sex affects relationships between men and women, basically, right? So let's open up this here. I thought this was a good image of parents and children. So that's, some parents doing some baking with their kids, I guess. I don't know. It's hard to say for sure. So anyway, the same way that discussion of sex can occur between young people and old people also applies to the relationship between children and parents. Maybe your parents want you to settle down, and or perhaps you convince them to be slightly more cavalier about how much of a big deal casual sex really is. Oh, I forgot to show you a picture for the relationship between young people and old people there. So I'll show you that one here as well. Oh, I didn't pull up a picture for that. I forgot that. Okay, that's all right. So anyway, there's similar behavior between teachers and students about sexuality as there is with parents and children, of course, right? Because both parents and teachers are these authoritarian figures, and well, at least when we're talking about young students, they have to listen to the teachers in similar but not exactly the same ways that children have to listen to their parents, especially when you're younger. But those relationships and how they work can change in terms of sexuality and many other factors, or perhaps not even sexuality if we're talking about parents and children, for example, right? So let me see here. So like I said, there's similar behavior between teachers and students about sexuality. Depending on the age of the students, how similar these interactions are to those between men and women or parents and children can change a lot. The relationship between most teachers and students in terms of sexuality is similar to that between parents and children. The adults interact with the children in a non-sexual way, and it's either discussed, talk about it is limited, or puritanical mindsets are often encouraged. If the children are older, like in high school or especially college, the types of relationships between teachers and students can be very different. that could blur the line between parents and children and men and women. Obviously, adult teachers are more likely to be sexually attracted to teenagers or adult college students in particular than to children. Unlike them, teenagers and adults, of course, actually have sexual urges and are more likely to be sexually attracted to teachers. So I have an interesting image here. It's kind of small. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a woman helping. It's a teacher helping students do some work on a tablet there, and she looks like they're happy and she's helping her learn and stuff. Oh, I forgot to screen share that one here. Let me screen share that one there. Just a sec. There you go. So that's a picture there of a teacher helping her students learn something on that tablet there. And so let me see here. So now we'll talk about the relationship between priests and the members of their congregations and how that can be similar to the relationship between parents and both parents and children and students and teachers, of course, because we're talking about how similarly to those other types of relationships, the priest is an authority figure, and not in exactly the same way as children, but people listen to their priests, even adults, as authority figures, right? So I thought this was a great image here of the Pope blessing people as they kneel to him, which is a good iconic image of the authoritarianism of priests and how much they can have over their congregations, of course, how much they don't necessarily always do. So the relationship between priests and people who go to their churches can be different as well. Most ministers often are pretty puritanical if and or when they talk about sex. In terms of their behavior, they probably act more like a parent does to a child or a teacher does to a student. They act in non-sexual ways. However, we know with the scandals of Catholic priests raping children that this can be nothing like that and totally fucked up, of course, right? So now let's talk about how the relationship between governments and their citizens in terms of sexuality and power can be similar to that between a parent and child, teacher and student, or parent and congregation member. So obviously, politicians can sometimes abuse their power, right? So I'm going to show a picture here. So a lot of people know, obviously, about the famous scandal and sexual assault allegations against Trump and how he supposedly had an affair with Stormy Daniels, right? So this is one of many examples about how, well, it could be an example about how politicians abuse their power. Like, if it's true that he paid her off, which he apparently did, then it could probably be used as an example of politicians abusing their power. So, like I said, the relationship between governments and their citizens can be similar to that between a parent and child, a teacher and student, and a minister and a congregation member. Politicians tend to act in non-sexual ways toward other people, but similarly to Catholic priests, though slightly less rapey in many cases, politicians are adults with sexual urges too. They have consensual sex with regular citizens, but like ministers, can also abuse their power and use it to sexually assault people. There are plenty of popular recent examples of this, including all the allegations against both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Countless others have happened as well, such as Bill Clinton famously lying about abusing his presidential power to get a blowjob from Monica Lewinsky. So we have Trump there looking all creepy, looking at Stormy Daniels' huge tits, right? So, and then there's, of course, as he has been deemed by definitely more conservative people in particular, creepy Joe Biden, who has been wanting children to sit on his lap and creepily sniffing people's hair and shit like that, apparently. So both this American president and the last one are known for being creeps. And of course, with Joe Biden, there were sexual assault allegations infamously with Tara Reid or whoever you say her name, and many other people too. And that's Joe Biden creepily sniffing a woman there. So, like I said, there's also we gotta talk about Bill Clinton for a second, of course, right? And like I said, he famously lied about getting a blowjob from Monica Lewinsky by abusing his power, essentially. So let's pull that up here. There we go. So that's a picture of creepy Bill Clinton lying about abusing his power to get a blowjob from Monica Lewinsky. So in the last part of that quote, though, Foucault again makes a clearly nuanced argument. He stresses that he's not saying that sex is all about power or vice versa. Foucault is also not setting up a binary, contrary to popular belief of public intellectuals who don't read his books, like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. He argues that sex is not the most important element of power, and it doesn't have more force than everything else in our behavior and relationships. However, it is the most useful aspect in some ways. It can be used as a tool to accomplish more goals than anything else in our interactions with other people. So, sex and sexuality are not the only or even the strongest ways that we influence one another, but they impact and can help us in more ways than other forms of behavior that can be used as tools. Foucault doesn't elaborate at all on the other details of how a relationship works. That could be one of the reasons that public intellectuals misinterpret and demonize him. However, again, he's making a nuanced argument. He is neither promoting nor demonizing sexuality or power. Okay, so anyway, I'll stop there for now. I know that Foucault can get extremely verbose and pedantic. The fact that his writing was translated into English from French doesn't help with his obscure and abstract philosophical terms either. I hope that I did a good job of explaining Foucault's opinions here. Thanks so much to everyone for watching this, and thanks to those of you who clicked the like button on this video. Share it everywhere, subscribe if you haven't done so already, and thanks especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. You have no idea how much I appreciate that. Even $1 a month makes a huge difference to me. I'll post the link for my page in the description of this video, as I always do. So, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. Read History of Sexuality too. It's awesome and fascinating. All right, thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.